Hello again, I'm Marn from the Miller branch, and I'm doing another video with some tips for adapting most machine sewn face mask patterns for hand sewing, for those of you who may not have a sewing machine at home. If you'd like to learn the 2 basic hand stitches I mentioned in this video, please check out the hand stitching tutorial we previously posted. The mask you'll see me working on is entirely hand sewn, so it is possible to do using a pattern put out by Providence St. Health. It doesn't require too many seams or elastic, so if you would like to give that one a try, the link for their excellent tutorial and pattern should be found in this post. However, feel free to use any pattern or tutorial you like. It should be fairly easy to adapt hand stitches where they tell you to sew by machine. However, if you're using a different pattern and you get stuck, still feel free to send us a message through Messenger and I will try and get back to you to help troubleshoot any problems. But if you are using a different pattern, please send a link to that pattern so I know what it is you're trying to do. Let's get started.
The very first adaptation for hand sewing is to usually do a back stitch anywhere where they tell you to sew by machine. So, for example, on the Providence St. Joseph or similar pattern with these pleats, I believe they tell you to stitch these pleats in place. I would do a back stitch here. Not only will it help hold them in place to make it easier when applying a tie, because without having those pins there, but it will also help reinforce keeping them in place and give you a little extra sturdiness, especially for the wash. So that's why I would recommend back stitching instead of just basting it, which is what you would normally do if you wanted to keep something in place. I'm sewing backwards here. So you can sew the whole length of it just to kind of hold things in place. I'm just going to start at the pleat. I believe their instructions are 1/4 inch in, so you can mark that if you need. I'm eyeballing it. Take a big starting. Again, I'm using black thread just so you can see what I'm doing. So just back stitching through all these layers to hold them in place. Nothing exciting. Doesn't even have to be that pretty. But see all the layers. So then it will end up looking like this. To continue the designs that have the ties on the side that cover up this raw edge that we've created, they recommend you use bias tape or, if you have ribbon or something that's not going to fray and it's wide enough that you can get it around this edge that will fray, great, go for that. If you don't have bias tape or ribbon or some other sort of thing, you can cut out of a length of fabric that their recommendation is, I believe, 34 inches long. And if it is a frayable fabric, they recommend it to be an inch and a half this direction. And then I ironed it to make it a little easier to work with. This is also the way bias tape would look. This is just not cut on the bias, so it doesn't have as much of a stretch. But if you do not have access to an iron, just fold it in, use a lot of pins, try and press it down with your hand or put a weight on it for a time. Ironing these creases in just makes it a lot easier to use. And their tutorials will go through applying this to the side. But if you want, you just fold it in half. So I found my center point. I had a little struggle there. Best practices is to actually mark it with a pin, or if you've got one of those water soluble markers, and then you find your center point on your mask. You match it up, 1/2, pin to the front side. And then the other side, just fold over. then you'll want to pin this. So this should all be in any tutorial you're looking at, and then they'll just tell you to machine stitch this. Easy peasy on a machine. It's a bit of sewing, quite a bit of sewing by hand, but you'll get there. Just pin it down, and then you just stitch along close to this edge. I would do a back stitch since this needs to be washed. You don't want it fraying while washing. However, the trickiest part is a machine can get through all these layers, if it's a good machine, pretty easily. It will be a little difficult by hand. So I would start underneath just to hide my knot, make it look a little nicer. I'd also use a lot more pins in this. I don't know where they all are. And I just sew along, doing a back stitch. If you're in a hurry, you could do a running stitch. But here, where it really needs to hold, I would do a back stitch. And as you're going along, it's going pretty good until you get to these thick parts here. I'm just going to jump to it and show you. And then your back stitch will get more difficult. It'll get more ugly. If you have a thimble, you can use a thimble to help push through all these layers. If the going gets really tough, you can do the not pretty, not efficient, but it'll get the job done. Stab the needle through, bring it through the other side, stab it back up, hopefully aiming for appropriate place. And again, you use if you can, a thread that matches your fabric, and then many errors will not show. I'm doing this in a contrasting color for you guys, and then stab it back down, and then pick it up on the other side. Oh, stab it back up until you find a good spot, bring it through, and then go back and do your back stitch again. So that can help you get through these many layers if you're trying to do it by hand. And then you just finish the rest of the tie. Like I said, just keep sewing along this edge. When you come to the end, these ends, if they are not selvage ends, this is selvage. It's been bound by the factory. You can just leave that. That will not fray. However, if you have cut this edge, or you're using scrap fabric you cut out of a skirt or something, if it already has a hem on it, you're good. But if it's something you've cut, it will fray. So you need to do a fun little fold this down and then fold your edge over. And fold your edge over and then fold it closed. And then you'll have to stitch right along here and then stitch around there. And that's just to keep it fraying. You might even be able to, if you skip this, get several washes out of it before it really starts to become a giant mess. But if you want it to last, my recommendation is to always fold raw edges in and stitch them down. And you don't have to worry about fraying. Another thing that you may run into that might be a little bit tricky to adapt for hand stitching is adding elastic for those patterns that call for elastic in the corners. If you've got elastic at home, I don't, so I can't even demonstrate it. But they will have you pin the elastic in the corners between the two sheets. So we'd have to pretend this isn't sewn in this spot yet, and you would stick it in the corner. And you'd pin it between. No, this is not exactly how you would pin it. You'd want your elastic. They'll instruct you. You'll want your elastic sticking into your project, and it would be pinned into the corner. If we're pretending this tie right here is is elastic. Or if you just want to put some ribbon ties there instead of applying it to the edge, like the pattern I've been working off of has done. If you don't want to do this, if you just want to put it in the corner, you put it between the corners, and then you would pin it, and then the patterns frequently instruct you to sew along all the edges. Since the elastic is quite thick, and that's a pretty a high tension point, with the hand stitching, you're going to want to make sure you really sew over the top of the elastic or ribbon very well. Ribbon being thinner, be easier, just do lots of back stitches. Run over it once with a back stitch, come back again, just for extra reinforcement. The elastic being a little thicker, you would probably want to sew up it through the elastic, come back up through the elastic, and just keep doing that several times to really reinforce it there, and then continue sewing all along the edge. If you are doing one of those patterns that has you sew along the edges and then turn it right side out to finish your seams that way, I would generally do a back stitch if that's the only sewing you're doing. If once they have you turn it right side out, they want you to sew on top again, then you could definitely do a running stitch, because the stitching on the top, it's called top stitching, haha, clever name. The top stitching will hold everything in place, so it won't actually be pulling on your running stitch too much. That's mostly just to hold it, to turn it. And one more hand stitching tip. If you are doing one of those ones where you sew along the edges and then turn it right side out, they will have you usually leave a gap in which to pull all of your work right side out. So just pretend this side is sewn. You would just grab it and pull it through that hole like a pillowcase, and then you would have all your seams on the inside, so you'd have a nice finished seam. We can pretend this side sewn, and then you'd probably have like half of a seam, and then you'd have this hole still open. Most of them will probably instruct you to just keep it folded down with the edge of the seam, and then sew across the top of it with a top stitch. I would do a back stitch. If you're not doing a face mask and you've watched this entire video just up to this point, and you want to make a nice invisible closure for your hole after turning your project right side out, like for a stuffed animal or a pillow, that sort of thing, you can do a type of stitch I cannot remember the name of. It might be a type of whip stitch. It doesn't matter, but it creates basically almost an invisible seam. So you would stick your, let's get in focus here, sorry. Stick your needle into one side of the fabric, and then you would just stick it in on the other side, pop out, and then just keep doing that. Stick it in the one side, stick it in the other side, and that kind of just closes it up a bit like a zipper, permanently though, like so. So then and if it wasn't black thread, it would probably be a little bit more invisible.
I hope these adaptations for hand sewing will help you create your own face mask at home. These were the ones I encountered and thought you may encounter with some of the other patterns, but like I mentioned, please send us a message to Messenger, and I will try and help you with anything else you may encounter that I didn't think of. Good luck with your sewing, and thank you for watching.